Right now, your coneflower is quietly deciding whether it comes back stronger next spring or never comes back at all. In the next few minutes, I'll show you the 3 August mistakes that quietly kill more coneflowers than almost anything else, and exactly how to avoid every one of them. If you care about your garden actually coming back stronger every year instead of thinner and weaker, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of thing we cover every single week. And before we get into it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what zone you're gardening in, because a few of these details do shift depending on your climate, and I want to know who's out there. Here's the thing about coneflowers in August. They don't look like they're in trouble. The blooms are still out, bees are still landing on them every morning, butterflies are still stopping by in the afternoon. Everything looks completely fine from where you're standing. And that's exactly the problem, because underneath all of that color, the plant is juggling 3 separate jobs at once. It's still trying to keep up the summer flower show. It's dealing with heat stress from the hottest weeks of the year. And at the same time, it's starting to build the root crown that has to carry it through winter and come back next spring. Most gardeners treat coneflower the same way in August as they did in June. Same watering, same feeding, same everything. But August is not June. The plant's priorities have quietly shifted, and if you don't shift with it, you won't find out until next spring, when the plant either comes back weaker than last year or doesn't come back at all. Let's start with the mistake almost everyone makes first, because it usually happens before anything else even crosses your mind. You walk outside on a hot August afternoon and your coneflower looks tired. The leaves are drooping, it looks thirsty. Every instinct in your body says grab the hose. Here's what's actually happening most of the time. That midday droop is often just the plant protecting itself. By curling and drooping its leaves in direct afternoon sun, it's reducing how much surface area is exposed to the heat, which cuts down on how much water it loses through the leaves. If the soil underneath still has decent moisture, that plant will usually stand back up on its own once the sun goes down and temperatures drop in the evening. It's not dying, it's coping. The mistake happens when gardeners see that afternoon droop and panic, and start watering every single day or every other day just to be safe. That feels responsible. It is not. Watering that often keeps the top few inches of soil constantly wet, and constantly wet soil close to the surface starves the roots underneath of oxygen. Coneflowers evolved out on open, well-drained grasslands, so their roots actually need that oxygen exchange to stay healthy. When the soil stays soggy for too long, you create exactly the right conditions for root rot and crown rot, caused by fungal organisms that thrive in low oxygen, waterlogged soil. So the well-meaning daily watering that felt like you were helping is often the exact thing quietly killing the plant from below. There's a second version of this trap worth knowing about if you've planted anything new this year. If you dug an individual planting hole and filled it with rich compost or peat moss surrounded by regular garden soil or clay, that amended hole can hold a lot more water than the soil around it. Water pools right there in that little pocket, right around the roots, and the plant essentially sits in a bathtub every time it rains or gets watered. The fix going forward for anything new you plant is to backfill with the same native soil that came out of the hole, not rich amended soil, so you don't create that trap in the first place. So what should you actually do instead? Water deeply, but far less often. For an established coneflower, roughly once every 10 to 14 days is usually plenty unless you're in a genuine, prolonged drought. And when you do water at the base of the plant, not overhead, and give it a slow, deep soak rather than a quick surface splash. That deep soak encourages roots to grow downward, chasing the moisture, which builds a stronger, more resilient root system heading into winter. A quick daily sprinkle does the opposite. It keeps roots shallow and lazy, right where the soil dries out fastest. If you want one simple test to know whether your plant actually needs water, check it in the morning. If it drooped in the afternoon heat but looks fine and upright again by the next morning after a cool night, leave it alone completely. That's normal behavior, not a cry for help. If it's still drooping the next morning after a full cool night to recover, that's when you know it's genuinely dry and needs a deep drink. Now let's talk about something almost nobody thinks about with coneflowers, which is the trade-off between blooming and surviving. Some coneflower varieties, especially the heavily bred, double-flowered or unusually colored cultivars you see at garden centers, are bred to produce a lot of flowers. Sometimes too many. These plants can pour so much of their energy into blooming that they never build the strong root crown they need to survive winter. In some cases, a plant can genuinely bloom itself to death in its first or second year, giving you a gorgeous summer and then simply not coming back. This matters most for anything you planted this year. A young coneflower's real job in its first summer isn't to put on a flower show for you, it's to build roots. Every flower it produces and every seed head it tries to mature costs energy that plant doesn't have much of yet. So if your coneflower went into the ground this spring or summer, here's the slightly painful advice. Pinch off the developing flower buds through August. I know that feels wrong. You planted it to see flowers, and now I'm telling you to remove them. But you're trading a few weeks of blooms this year for a plant that comes back stronger and healthier for years afterward. It's one of those decisions that feels like a mistake in the moment and pays you back every season after. For coneflowers that are already established, the concern shifts a little. Taller varieties in particular can flop over during a heavy August storm or a windy afternoon, especially once they're carrying a lot of heavy flower heads. If that's a problem you deal with every year, here's a tip to remember for next spring rather than right now. Cutting the stems back by about 1/3 to 1/2 in late May, sometimes called the Chelsea chop, delays the first bloom by a couple of weeks, but it results in shorter, thicker, more heavily branched stems that stand up through August wind and rain without needing to be staked. Not something to do this month, but worth writing down for next year. If you're finding this useful so far, this is a good moment to make sure you're subscribed, because the next part is honestly the piece that trips up more gardeners than anything else in this video, and timing it right matters more than almost any other decision you'll make with this plant all month. Here's the core idea to hold on to for the rest of August. This month is not one single block of time as far as your coneflower is concerned. It splits into two very different phases, and treating the whole month the same way is exactly where most gardeners go wrong. In the first half of August, selective deadheading is genuinely a good thing to do. When you spot a flower that's clearly finished, faded petals, papery texture, starting to droop, follow the stem down to the nearest healthy pair of leaves or a smaller side bud that's already forming, and make your cut just above that point. That single cut redirects the plant's energy away from finishing that seed head and toward producing another round of blooms instead. Done consistently through early August, this can stretch your flowering season by as much as 3 weeks. It also keeps fresh nectar available for late-season pollinators, including monarch butterflies that are migrating through and relying on flowers like these along the way. But by the second half of August, that same habit needs to stop completely. This is the part almost everyone misses because it feels backwards. You've spent weeks tidying up faded blooms, and it's hard to just stop. But late in the month, your coneflower needs to shift into shutting down for the season, not producing more growth. Letting that final round of flowers fade naturally and go to seed sends a signal to the plant to slow down and start moving its stored sugars downward into the roots and crown, which is exactly the reserve it needs to survive winter and come back strong next spring. If you keep deadheading into late August, you're encouraging soft, tender new growth right when the plant should be hardening off for cold weather, and that soft growth is usually the first thing damaged when the first real frost hits. If you don't want to rely on a fixed date, and honestly you shouldn't since timing shifts a bit depending on where you live, watch the plant itself. Pay attention to the pollinator traffic on your older blooms. When you notice fewer bees and butterflies stopping by those flowers, and the center cone starts turning firmer and darker instead of soft and pale, that's your plant telling you the transition has started. Once you see that shift, put the pruners away for the season. Next, let's clear up something that trips up a lot of people in late summer, and that's fertilizer. By August, coneflower foliage can look a little pale, a little tired, maybe not as vibrant as it was in June. The instinct is to assume the plant needs a boost and reach for fertilizer. In most established plantings, that's the wrong read. That pale look in late summer is rarely caused by a lack of nutrients. It's far more often a sign of the plant simply being crowded by its neighbors, mild water stress, or in some cases, an early symptom of disease that fertilizer won't fix anyway. Feeding a high nitrogen fertilizer this late in the season actively works against what the plant is trying to do. Nitrogen pushes out fresh, tender vegetative growth right when the plant should be slowing down and preparing for dormancy. That soft new tissue doesn't have the tougher protective layers that mature growth has, which makes it an easy target for aphids and other pests looking for the tenderest leaves around. It's also more vulnerable to fungal problems like powdery mildew, and because it hasn't had time to properly harden off before the cold arrives, that new growth is often the first thing to die back when the first hard frost hits, sometimes taking damage right down into the crown with it. The simple rule here is that a healthy coneflower growing in reasonably average soil doesn't need any fertilizer at all through the back half of the season. If your soil is genuinely poor, the right move is a light layer of compost or a slow release, low nitrogen feed applied in early spring when new growth is just starting, not in August. While we're talking about the base of the plant, let's talk about mulch, because this is a small detail that causes real problems if it's overlooked. If mulch is piled directly up against the stems, right where the stem meets the roots, an area called the crown, it traps moisture right there, in exactly the spot that needs to stay relatively dry. That constant dampness softens plant tissue and gives fungal problems an easy way in. The fix takes about a minute. Just pull the mulch back a few inches from the base of each plant, so there's a small clear gap around the stems, while the rest of the bed stays mulched normally. Now here's a section worth paying close attention to, because getting it wrong in either direction can cost you a plant unnecessarily, or let a real problem spread through your whole garden. There are two coneflower problems that can look similar at a glance in August, but they need completely different responses, and mixing them up is a costly mistake either way. The first is something called coneflower rosette mite damage. These are microscopic mites, far too small to see with the naked eye, that feed inside developing flower buds. Their feeding triggers strange, abnormal growth, and you'll notice small, green to reddish-green, tufted, almost leafy-looking growths sprouting directly out of the center cone where a normal flower should be. Here's the key detail that tells you this is the less serious problem. The rest of the plant, the leaves, the stems, the overall shape, stays completely healthy and green. The damage is limited strictly to that one flower head. If you see this, the fix is simple. Snip off the affected flower heads, seal them in a bag, and throw them in the household trash rather than the compost pile, and let the rest of the plant carry on as normal. The second problem is aster yellows, and this one is far more serious. It's caused by a phytoplasma, a bacteria-like organism that's spread by a small insect called the aster leafhopper as it feeds on plant sap and moves from plant to plant. Unlike the mite damage, this disease is systemic, meaning it affects the entire plant, not just one flower. The signs to watch for are quite different too. Petals turning green or taking on a strange, leaf-like appearance instead of their normal color. Leaves that look yellowed, curled, and stunted. And an overall growth habit that looks unusually dense, tight, and stunted compared to the rest of your healthy plants nearby. There is no cure for this once a plant is infected. If you see these symptoms, the entire plant, including the root system, needs to be dug up and disposed of, not composted, as soon as you can. To stop it from spreading further into your garden. If you only remember one thing from this section, remember this. If it's just the flower that looks strange while the rest of the plant looks healthy and green, that's very likely the mite, and it's manageable. If the whole plant looks off, yellowing leaves, stunted growth and all, that's the more serious disease, and it needs to come out completely. While you're out there checking your flowers closely, you might notice slender, reddish-tan beetles crawling around on the blooms. A lot of gardeners assume these are pests simply because they're so visible and so numerous. In reality, these are usually soldier beetles, and they're some of the best insects you can have in your garden. They help with pollination as they move flower to flower, and their larvae actively hunt down aphids and other small pest insects. If you see them on your coneflowers, leave them alone. Reaching for an insecticide because you spotted them can wipe out one of the most helpful predators working in your garden for free. One more thing worth knowing about August, since it's actually a better month than most people realize for adding new coneflowers to your garden, even though it's the wrong month for moving the ones you already have. If you're planting a new containerized coneflower this month, the warm soil at root depth in August actually speeds up root development in the weeks before winter dormancy sets in, and container-grown plants purchased this time of year often come with more stored energy than the same plants sold in spring. The one detail that matters most here is what you backfill the hole with. Use the native soil that came out of the hole, not rich compost or amended soil. If you create a soft, rich pocket surrounded by denser native soil, you end up with the same uneven moisture problem we talked about earlier, and it stresses the roots right when they're trying to establish. What you should not do in August is divide or transplant coneflowers that are already established in the ground. Cutting into mature roots during summer heat disrupts how the plant moves water internally, and it leaves wounds that are an easy entry point for disease while the weather is still warm. Save dividing established clumps for early spring, or for late autumn once the plant has gone fully dormant. Let's finish with what to leave alone completely for the rest of the season. Once you've stopped deadheading in late August, resist the urge to tidy everything up further. Those spiky, dried-out seed heads left standing aren't garden mess. They're an important food source for goldfinches and other birds through fall and winter, and watching them feed on those cones is honestly one of the small joys of leaving a garden a little less manicured. The dead, hollow stems left standing through winter matter too, since several species of native solitary bees use them as nesting sites during the colder months. If you cut everything down to the ground in autumn, you're removing that shelter completely. The better routine is to leave the stems standing all winter, then in early spring, cut back to somewhere around 12 to 24 inches instead of all the way to the ground. New growth will come up and hide the old stems, while the nesting sites inside them stay intact for the bees that will return to pollinate your garden again. So here's everything your coneflower actually needs this August, all in one place. Don't panic over afternoon wilting. Check it again the next morning before you decide to water. Water deep and infrequent rather than a little bit every day. Pinch the buds on anything you planted this year so it builds roots instead of burning through its energy on flowers. Deadhead through early August to extend your bloom window, then stop completely by late August so the plant can shift its energy down into the roots. Skip the fertilizer unless your soil is genuinely poor. Keep mulch pulled back from the crown. Learn to tell mite damage apart from aster yellows, since one is harmless and one means the whole plant has to go. Leave the soldier beetles alone. If you're planting something new, backfill with native soil, not compost. And once late August arrives, leave the seed heads and the stems standing for the birds and the bees that depend on them through winter. None of these steps are difficult on their own. The difference between a coneflower that comes back stronger every year and one that quietly fades away usually comes down to doing each of these at the right moment, not the wrong one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me what your coneflowers actually look like right now, and which of these mistakes you didn't know about until today. If this helped you out, hit subscribe, because next time we're getting into another late summer perennial that most gardeners are quietly getting wrong without even realizing it. I'll see you in the next one.